Good morning, everyone. Hope all of you are doing well and safe. We welcome everyone and thank you for being a part of the webinar today. ISCM, in association with SAP, brings you on stage discussion with pharma industry leaders discussing on life science and chemical supply chain resilience post-pandemic. But before we move ahead, certain ground rules for all the attendees here. This platform is on listen-only mode, and on the right-hand side, there is a control panel. You can keep typing your questions and sending it to us through the question tab. So let's get started. And to do the first session, let me invite on stage Dr. Rakesh Singh, Chairman, Institute of Supply Chain Management, to open up the discussion. Dr. Rakesh Singh.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you for being here for the Pharma and Chemical Supply Chain Resilience webinar. I have the privilege of introducing you the webinar and discussion points that we will be taking into account as we move ahead. All of us have known that this pandemic has been very different from any other disruptions, whether it has been tsunami, earthquake, floods, natural disasters of any kind, even geopolitical. What it has really done is that it has affected supply on the one side and demand on the other side, and supply on not only from the single source China, but across the globe. As the pandemic length and breadth increased, we had this major difficulty in understanding supply chain outside in outputs to balance the supply chain or integrate the supply chain. So according to me, we will be really dealing with this particular concept of the unknown and how do you make them known in terms of tackling the uncertainty. And few key points that we will be looking at is that how do we monitor and improve costs to have visibility into where pursuing dollars are spent? Are we agile enough to refocus our resources during the pandemic, secure the supply bases in the right way? Managing and tracking demand signals by orders as well as outside in approaches, and also by building scenarios as the pandemic takes its new course. We need to understand what is the spread of pandemic in terms of its length and breadth across the globe. How do we really map these things, and how do you build scenario on the base worst case and the best case scenarios to see that we build resilience policy? And in the process, I think it is very important for us to have a stress test. And I think a professor in Harvard MIT has come out with a very interesting methodology which can be quantified, which says that if your time to recover is more than your time of survival, then you need to really relook at your strategic sourcing strategies. Your geography of your supply chain, manufacturing and sourcing need to go an amazing change. And if not, then you can have a very strong multi-tier understanding of visibility and create a resilience policy. I think in the debate as we move ahead, we'll be talking about these resiliences in terms of pharma and chemical industry. We will explore multi-shoring, near-shoring, platform, product and plant harmonization, ecosystem partnership, inventory and capacity buffers, manufacturing network diversification. That will help us to build resilience along with a very critical, important input, that's people. And how do you really look at the bionic supply chain, the new supply chain, where people become focused in the resiliency? So I think these are the broader issues that we would be covering in the process of our discussion as well as the fireside chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Singh, to set the tone for the discussions ahead. We now move ahead to the fireside chat. And to do that, I would invite Sumat Tomar. Sumat Tomar, who leads the go-to-market initiative for SAP Ariba's direct spend management solutions across APG and is based in Singapore. He has around 20 years of expertise in supply chain and procurement space. Sumit, I hand it over to you to take the discussion further. And I would request all the attendees to keep typing your question and sending it to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaisal. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Pleased to be here. To take this discussion forward, I would like to actually invite my colleague, Greg Mekjian, who's our head of direct spend portfolio for the globe. He's based out of North America and represents and has over 30 years of experience. So before I move to the actual fireside chat, I would like Greg to basically introduce himself and maybe say a few words. Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Sumat, and welcome everybody. Good morning, participants. My name is Greg Mekjian. As Sumat has mentioned, I'm starting my 31st year at SAP. I am responsible globally for many of the attributes that Dr. Singh just mentioned, the orchestration and the execution and supply chain, most notably in the process industries, especially in pharmaceutical and med device, and then of course the chemicals industry. So I'm very happy to participate here and to give some perspectives as it pertains to what our clients and their extended supply chains face every day. Thanks, Sumat.
Thanks, Greg. So let's get started. And I would want to basically start by setting some context in terms of how I would like to set this discussion. So I wanted to basically understand that this is a highly regulated industries, pharmaceutical, chemicals, and all, by the very nature of this and the kind of implication it has in terms of everything else around it. So what I wanted to understand from you is that what kind of challenges and issues have you seen over the years in this industry, which are very specific to this industry, if you could highlight that, and maybe then also try and put this into the current context of COVID, with maybe that would be a good starting point, Greg.
Yeah, so I echo what Dr. Singh said earlier on his opening diatribe. We've not witnessed such a disruption in supply chain activities before, at least in our lifetimes, to our knowledge. Automotive strikes, tsunamis, geopolitical scenarios. I echo everything that he mentioned. Our clients are trying to determine everything from alternative sources of supply to optimizing cold chain and blockchain requirements. They are still struggling with tracking and tracing very, very specific properties of lots of their individual products, visibility to their supply chains and inventory buffers. Hopefully are in a position where they are visible to the OEM and to specific trading partners. And it's not a single tier. These transportation lanes, of course, span multiple countries and, of course, multiple continents, which add additional flavor to the challenge. Advanced planning capabilities for constraints are attempting to be put in place, but therein lies the actual communication channels are being stressed and are being challenged. Add on top of that specific regulatory requirements that, at least here in this country, and I'm pointing specifically to 21 CFR Part 11, which require suppliers to major OEMs, Bristol Myers, the Johnson & Johnson folks, Merck, Takeda, you name them, the larger pharmaceutical companies are required to identify specific batches and lots with actual signatures of the people taking inspections of these specific lots, which stresses the supply chain and specifically contract manufacturing organizations, as well as the API suppliers. While these particular requirements are born inside of pharmaceuticals, they're not isolated. The chemicals industry themselves want to have and instill such disciplines of quality on batches, tracking and tracing as well in their particular industry. SAP defines the life sciences industry as two segments. One is pharmaceuticals, such as Novartis or Thermofisher or AstraZeneca or the like, but the other piece is med device, Zimmer, Stryker, Boston Scientific. These kinds of companies, which are my clients, are more high-tech-ish than they are even pharmaceuticals. And as a result, what I would argue is what we see in the marketplace, Sumat, as a kind of a barrier to entry is that segment is more in tune with the technology that has already been established in network environments and is more in tune with enablement of their own companies to participate in a larger supply chain network. Whereas what we've seen in the chemicals and pharmaceutical industries proper is a basic immaturity and a hurdle associated with education and acceptance of this kind of technology. So it's a tough world out there right now. When you include COVID and then you include a predominant portion of contract manufacturers and APIs coming from the countries of India and China, where a lot of consumption is, of course, global, this lends itself to also geopolitical constraints. So all of these things face our clients in this particular marketplace to basically provide visibility to where are their components, where are their APIs, where, if I'm a toller in the chemicals industry, where are my demand streams and can they be static, or am I having to deal with bullwhip effect? So it's just about every single thing in the recipe, Sumat, that's thrown together is being faced at by our clients.
Perfect. That was pretty comprehensive response from you, Greg. The other question that I wanted to ask you on this as a follow-up would be that because of some of these geopolitical issues that you touched upon and the very nature of, I mean, the US-China tension, for example, the whole COVID situation, how do you see those impacting, and what are some of the emerging trends within this industry that you see based on your interactions with some of the global thought leaders or leaders within this space?
Great question. Thanks, Tomar, for asking that. I mean, I'm an ex-practitioner in this. When I was in industry, my background is more logistics and more manufacturing oriented by virtue of my education and my passion. The notion associated with where my parts are, where my components are, where my raw materials, where is my WIP, the cash to cash cycle time as it pertains to finance and KPIs still resonate today. We always try to find a single source of supply, Sumat, in my past history, because it's just much easier from a management point of view to support that, to find specific companies like Thermofisher, who's on the speaker circuit here today, to be able to find really, really successful and supportive contract manufacturers out of their Patheon division if I'm going to manufacture a product on behalf of Merck. That's a real life scenario that has in production what I would argue a very, very complete supply chain scenario with orders, as Dr. Singh suggested, advanced shipping notifications, manufacturing visibility as to what is taking place at the Patheon plant and when expected deliveries are going to be with quality notifications and inspection plans. That's a full assortment of capabilities. The current administration, at least in the United States, and I don't think that this is the idea alone, forces alternate sources of supply to be discovered. This in and of itself is a challenge for my clients who are moving from one particular paradigm to the other. This is a real challenge to find different sources of supplies located in specific areas that perhaps are not hot zones or potential hot zones. What are the hot zones? We've had clients actually not have communications via the telephone with their major key CMOs, tollers, and suppliers of API, and yet they can detect that there's an advanced shipping notification coming from Shanghai, let's say. That means that their source of supply is not cut. So these channels have upside as it pertains to COVID. If the current administration has their way, not unlike in our Department of Defense contractors here in the United States, and I would argue other countries, the limitation of pharmaceuticals and API are going to be born in the United States. Will that happen overnight? Probably not. Will that be a force that's very much associated with standards that are more dictated towards the Department of Defense here in the States? I think that's probably what my customers are going to face with their supply chains, is to find those particular sources of supply that either walk the tightrope between this geopolitical scenario or provide capabilities of their APIs inside of this country, at least this hemisphere. That's my insights associated with the geopolitical combined with COVID based on what's happening here in the States.
Okay, thanks for that perspective. So what you suggested is that finding newer alternate sources of supplies and having that agility in this entire supply chain would be the critical function going forward. And that leads me into the last question on this, which is basically that how do you see the network economies or playing out in the future world? And do you see I mean, a lot of the customers are talking about digitization, but when is the right time to start that journey? And what are the critical factors that one needs to consider before they embark on that journey?
I can give you a perspective associated with the industries that we're describing today, which I live with every day. And so does our Tiger team, so does our global organizational structure focus on. Different industries are handling it in different ways. It depends on the actual finished goods that are being produced. For example, consumer packaged goods in flight is reswizzling their supply chains to outsource more requirements, as Dr. Singh had kind of alluded to earlier. This whole notion of co-packers and co-man is actually in flight and being pressed more and more in this particular industry. I'm seeing the same thing in med device because they've digitized their supply chains in large part already from the high-tech industry. Consumer packaged goods with the likes of companies like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, PepsiCo, AB InBev, these are all of our lucky enough to be our clients. We're lucky enough to have them as clients. I don't want to present a different perspective in that respect. We're blessed with our clients, but they're trying to find people to manufacture products on their behalf in the regional areas where their consumption is the greatest. And that is something that they may have been caught a little bit off guard with. This is what we're perceiving in our industry. All of them are looking for the capability to share inventory, reduce bullwhip with their trading partners, provide this elasticity of the digital environment to reduce the latency of time between planning and execution. No longer are the days going to be acceptable when an available to promise or a local constraint is brought up 2 or 3 weeks out. Folks are manufacturing products in a just-in-day, if not just-in-time basis, so that they can restock shelves at retailers, distribution centers, etc. In this industry, pharmaceuticals and chemicals, there is a trend more towards the digital platform. And it starts with product design, new product introduction, the collaboration now actually being driven from the COVID crisis to bring products to market faster, cheaper, with a higher degree of quality, is stressing the supply chain, which then of course follows in place with finding new sources of supply by virtue of the profile and the qualities associated with the supplier that the OEM is looking for. In pharmaceuticals, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, we see that there is an immaturity in the education of digital platforms and networks. Pharmaceuticals are getting there, but they're needing to get a little bit more jump-started in the form of their supplier community to allow this digital, let's call it flow, coming in from networks to reduce the latency and provide visibility and quality information. I would argue also transportation information in and amongst the trading partners in pharmaceuticals. We've got a great amount of experience in this. It's not easy. There are constraints and barriers to entry and some culturalistic, but I think that the pharmaceutical and the tollers associated with chemicals will see their way within the next 5 years. Otherwise, they will become extinct. They will be troubled if they're not providing these kinds of capabilities to their OEM customers and trading partners. This is our perspective.
Thank you, Greg. I think I'm just also conscious of the time here. Thanks for your time. I know it's late, but thank you once again for being here with us and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Sumat, and thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Jaisal, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Greg. Thanks for being there. Wonderful insights. And as we're running out of time, I would go ahead and invite all our pharmaceutical leaders to join on stage for the panel discussion. Let me invite on stage Dr. Ravi Prakash Mathur, Vice President Supply Chain Management from Dr. Reddy's, Shayam Tiwari, Head Procurement from Bbraun Medical, Jigar Bhadra, Head of Procurement at GSK Pharmaceuticals, Keyur Pandya, General Manager Supply Chain from Thermofisher Scientific, Donovan, Intelligence Pen Evangelist at SAP, and Dr. Rakesh Singh, Chairman, Institute of Supply Chain Management. I would request Dr. Rakesh Singh to kindly lead the discussion, and to all the attendees, please type in and send your questions to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaisal, and thank you, Gregory. That was indeed a great insight into the dynamics of pharmaceutical supply chain management, that it should emerge and as it is emerging, as well as the immaturity in the pharma supply chain, because you're so right. If you compare even on the normal supply chain basis and you start looking at the pharma supply chain, and you find that the pharma supply chain where the cost structure from the raw material is around 51%. If you look at measuring them in terms of even cash to cash cycle, a report from the PwC says that cash to cash cycle in terms of days for pharmaceutical is 179, which is highest among almost all the industry group, where automotives also are 94, food and beverages 14, hard disk drive is 15, high tech electronics is just 5, and retail is around 15. And if you look at, in fact, the manufacturing lead time is around 140 days, whereas FMCGs have just 5 days. If you look at inventory days, you have FMCG with 72 and pharmaceutical with 258 days. Obsolescence is 3% of the sales in pharmaceutical, and in FMCG it's 0.05. There could be some variation, that report is from 2019, but there is a little bit of immaturity on the overall supply chain as compared to other industry for some reason in the pharma sector, this thing. And this COVID has actually, because pharma has been an essential element of life and livelihood also in this country, it has actually, survived a lot of it. But COVID has had a very large impact on all industries in the country, including pharma. To take the discussion further, I would ask Dr. Ravi Prakash Mathur to tell us about the kind of demand disruptions that pharma industry has seen, because it's an essential industry. A lot of us believe that there wouldn't have been any demand disruptions, but what kind of demand disruptions have we seen as a beginning of the COVID-19 until now?
Thanks, Dr. Singh. That was a very, relevant question, and must also comment on a rather unflattering introduction to the pharma supply chain with all those numbers about, your cash cycles and your inventory days and all that. So, first I'll just like to give a little context to the industry, especially the generic industry. So the reason why it is not fair to compare those numbers of a pharma industry, say, with that of the aviation industry or with the automobile industry is because the pharma business model per se, especially the generic model, competes on inventory availability. It is, as the name suggests, it is generic. So there is an element of substitution which is always possible over there. So the moment you are not available in the market, say on the shelf of a pharmacy, for a generic player, it is very easy to get substituted with another generic this thing. So traditionally, by the business model itself, the pharma industry carries higher inventories. Of course, other industries which are say aviation, which are largely MTO, you would imagine, okay, it doesn't need to carry raw material or other sort of material that is required required, for fulfilling the demand. So similarly, when you just track this phenomena backward, there are large inventories even in WIP. There are large inventories even in the raw material. Now you might look at it as a problem area, but you can also look at it as an opportunity, because what has happened is when the pandemic situation happened, these inventories which were available, they actually acted as buffers that enabled the people to kind of absorb the shock. That's point number one. Now, to your specific question about how the demand has got disrupted, what our observation has been, see, the demand getting disrupted from a pure demand angle or a pure demand play. A consumer demand having gone up or a consumer demand having gone down, that is one part of the way how you look at demand, right? The other part is the demand gets shifted between players, and the reason why the demands actually get shifted because somebody's supply chain has got disrupted and the demand has to shift to an alternate player. Okay, this will happen at all the nodes. It will happen at the formulation node, which is the consumer facing node. It will happen at the API layer. It will happen at your key starting material layer. It will happen everywhere. Okay, so while the numbers will tell you that things are not really impacted, but the undercurrents tell you that there's a lot of things that are happening, happening within the various supply chains or the competing supply chain, and the people who have been able to crack that or have been able to solve for it are the people who are doing well and who will continue to do well. Okay, so I like to link it back to the earlier, the question or discussion we had about technology, and I think in such a volatile scenario where you really cannot predict what the demand is going to be, whether it is coming out of a disrupted supply chain or that the demand is coming from a pure demand play factor, the capability that you need to deal with the situation or to actually plan for it has to be technology oriented. Then that is the place where digital come in. Traditional digital platforms or traditional digital engines like SAP or the others, they are actually planning engines. Okay, they are not really response engines. So the thought process is this: there is a demand, you push it back into your system, you plan for it, and then execution is just executing whatever the orders are there, whether they are process orders, stock transfer orders, or whatever is there. Now, to deal with a highly volatile situation, even your response needs to be dynamic. Okay, and that is where the new technologies of scenario building and scenario modeling come into the picture, right? So if you are, number one, you do not know what the demand is going to be, so you have to plan for scenarios. So you have to plan for scenario A, you have to plan for scenario B, you have to plan for scenario 3. How can you do that unless your system gives you that ability to look backward and say, hey, this is the possible scenario which I think is likely to play out. Can I meet the demand for that? Can I check alternate scenario? Can I check one more scenario? Okay. Now it has to be at at the level of your production capacity, which could be constrained. You have to check a constrained availability of even your material. That is why your visibility of material all the way back to your purchase orders placed on your suppliers, your inventory in transit, that actually comes into the picture. So you have to evolve to the next level of planning and execution, to next level of checking the scenario, seeing if it is possible, and then committing to the execution plan. So I think this is the new normal, and there are technologies out there that are evolving in this manner. And I think more and more of this thought process will evolve, and it has to be supported by technology in terms of faster computing, your design architecture itself that enables you to compute faster, because you cannot really even the backend architecture of these technology platforms, they need to check. Right. They cannot. Right. Sorry if I exceeded the allotted time, but that was the kind of thought process I had.
Jigar, you have been into marketing procurement. Your views on demand disruptions, and also if you see there has been a lot of change in category consumption, channel selection, shopper frequency, brand preferences, media consumption, even in pharmaceutical in India. We have seen the channel selection as one of the biggest challenge in the first part of this thing. What are your views on demand disruptions?
So guys, with GSK, we have a portfolio majorly towards acute therapies, right, which is anti-infectives. And given the season that we are in here in India, which is in the mid of monsoon, this is our peak season, right? So even in those things, and then we have our vaccines business. So what we saw in first place, the communication that we do to HCPs, which is healthcare professionals, to doctors and to medical owners or pharmacy owners, that had to go through a lot of change because, a lot of doctors were not showing up at their clinics. Also, a lot of doctors were then hoping that the senior leaders would reach out to them, right? Not the medical reps, but senior leaders would reach out to them for a conversation. So that was the expectation, right? Which we learned much faster in the process. But at the same point of time, we also had to be agile and really look at the opportunity, right? Which was, we thought that reaching out for a senior leader to reach out to each and every doctor, roughly about 400,000 doctors that we talk to every month was not possible, right? So we thought now that the doctors are not going to the clinic, there is very far and few virtual OPD programs that are going on. There are very few consultations that they do over WhatsApp. So they have time. So let them engage into, therapy area conversations through, organizing webinars. So I think what we saw, our engagement level really shot up on the webinar side, right? So the channel of communication or the content that we wanted to feed our doctors changed from face-to-face, from digital to a personalized webinar kind of a solution, just like this. So we had to make sure that our content team was ready, right? In order to create a meaningful, engaging content on a webinar, if you are doing a 45 minutes to a 90 minutes webinar, you have to ensure that the content is relevant to all the doctors that we reach out to. And these are a lot of GPs, pediatricians, general practitioners, chest physicians, and in our specialty medicine, endocrinologists, right? Because that's RESPI is our innovative wing. And the vaccine side, we got a push from doctors because we deal in majority of pediatric vaccines, right? So we assumed, so instead of retracting the spend on comms, we essentially took the position of the market leader and went out and, motivated parents by doing direct to consumer advertising on TV, right? So in times like this, there are, so we were having this session last week with, YSL, it's a consulting organization, YSC, sorry. And they said that over the past few, globally changing scenarios, such as, the economic recession of 2008, the H1N1 influenza, right? Only 9% of companies really did well. And the characteristics of that 9% was that instead of retracting spend on advertisement, they marketed more. For example, Kellogg's in 1800s, really spent a lot more money. They doubled their media spend, right? In order to reach out to consumers, to increase the consumption of cornflakes. So that is the strategy that we adopted here at GSK. We really did, we reached out to roughly about our touch points, right? Or the matrix was roughly about reaching out to 300 million of SEC audiences, right? In order to really create vaccine awareness that do not let your kids miss vaccines because of this pandemic, right? Because we essentially didn't play on the fear, but we essentially thought that, yes, it's a pandemic, it's a scary situation. Taking your kid to a pediatrician will open up to a lot of risk, so on and so forth, but not getting them timely vaccination also opens them to a lot of risk, right? So, and it worked, right? And when we were to restart our business, we really were able to recover all the lost volume that we had due to the lockdown. So, and we are constantly, and see, during the pandemic as well, I also managed logistics as a category.
We'll come back to that, Jigar.
Sure.
Let me go to Shayam Tiwari. Shayam, you know that 51% of the total cost is raw material, 65% comes from China in terms of sourcing, and largely 70% is API. What are your views during this disruption? How did you all manage the supply basis?
Yes, so thanks
Was there
everybody
any
and
disruption?
all the, yes, thanks everybody and the panelists and Dr. Singh and all the viewers. I think especially just to give you my introduction, I've been in China for last 2 years, so managed the operations. So like we had a significant interruption in the beginning of the year, but then most of the Chinese manufacturer did recoup, and it comes to some 40-50% normalization. And then you are again back to the drawing board that what is the right strategy in a short term or a medium term, and what could be the long term, especially I'm talking about API. So as in some of the key APIs, I think I have colleagues from Dr. Reddy's and other pharma company. The portfolio of Bbraun is a mix of both pharmaceutical as well as medical devices. So in the API side, we still do carry these risks and of course one of the higher inventory levels, but that is also not the solution which we have because the other side also see the demand shrinking, so cash flows challenges are also kicking in, is already there. So from that perspective, we are looking to wherever we can hedge the risk, but in the medium term we need to work a solution with the Chinese manufacturers which we all use in the industry. But in the long term, we have to really view it how India built the ecosystem to become a self-sufficient. So it's a larger question how the collaboration between the private sector and the government will work out. Who will bring those investments? How that investment will pay off? Because those are a very large question, and in the medium term, there will be increase in the price. So actually, this percentage what you're talking about will go a little higher up, and we have seen in the last 4 months. And that will eventually come down once we have a more self-reliant, resilient supply chain. So that is what our experience in the API side of it. We also have learned quite a bit lessons in the packaging category, which we usually take it, let's say it's a very small portion of inventory of 20% or 15%, but it can interrupt very significantly because most of the pharma company or medical device company were running this operation on GIT pattern, and when the pandemic hit and also it hit the suppliers, it's the largest scale interruptions all across the industry. So that is also some of the lessons which we have learned, and possibly it is going in the reverse direction, and it continue to be in the reverse direction for some time, unless until we figure it out the right way of visibility in the supply chain. So these are some of our key learning in the pandemic.
Thank you, Shayam. That's a good introduction to the securing of supply bases. I know some company like Diversity, they could see the pandemic coming in India. They started looking at supply bases much faster to alternate supply bases, and they could secure that because they had huge, surge in their demand, 10 times surge in demand. They had to really manage that. And I think one of the things that we need to really look at is that how do you foresee these things coming, building scenarios, looking at what was happening in China. Gordon, in fact, Gregory has done an amazing job of putting technology into perspective. And you know that with this extreme demand and supply shock, we have seen organizational completely shift their priority and focus. Suddenly, supply chain risk, tech-enabled real-time supply chain visibility, digitalization has really acquired an importance. What, according to you, would be the role of technology and digital transformation in building end-to-end supply chain visibility and mapping?
Thank you for that, and thanks to the panelists earlier. And I think, look, digital, I think, has got a big role to play. I was reading an article the other day, and the Microsoft CEO said that they had done 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months because they had to. So when we think about what the promise of digital, it covers all aspects of the supply chain. There's been a couple of articles that I've seen recently, one from McKinsey and one from Boston Consulting Group, and they talk about what the shifts in digital technology are. So for procurement, it's digital spend cubes, it's reverse auctions, it's clean sheet negotiations, it's computer aided design, and some of these can bring in up to 8%, according to McKinsey, in material cost reduction. For supply chains, it's about dynamic routing, it's predictive analytics, it's creating digital twins, which can deliver up to 30% in on-time, in-full improvements. So the digital transformation of the procurement function requires much more than just automating a few processes. I think companies implementing digital technologies need to do so with the goal of strengthening and sustaining their competitive position in marketplaces. And then those that take that approach are likely to surpass their competition by leaps and bounds. And those that don't, I think, are going to keep falling further and further behind. For me, one of the crucial things that we miss in digitization is how is our organization's digital IQ? So, and digital IQ for me is about the relationship with technology. If EQ is about our relationships with other people, then digital IQ is about our relationship with technology. So it's more than the ability to use digital tools, but rather the ability to know why, to know what, to know how, and when the use of digital technology will improve effectiveness and outcomes.
Thank you, Gregory, for being short and very clear on that. And I think digital will play a big role in mapping the whole organization in terms of this thing, and building scenario will become an effective part with the kind of predictive analytics and machine learning that comes into big way in almost all the technology. That would be the future technology. Now, moving ahead, I would request Keyur to give us a little snapshot on why life sciences companies are extremely dependent on contract manufacturers. What steps are companies taking to provide greater visibility into their contract manufacturing supply chains?
Thanks, Dr. Rakesh, for this question, and thanks to all the panel members who spoke earlier. Very insightful points of discussion. I think from the life science perspective, I think a couple of points. As we see that the dependability or the requirement of products in this kind of a pandemic is very critical, and time to service or time to go to market plays a critical role. And in all cases, if your dependency is going to be on your own manufacturing facilities, then probably the geography that you will be able to cover within India may not suit. So from that perspective, contract manufacturing route plays a very, very important role to cover the geography of India. And it also enables you service to the customer much, much faster. From the point that the life-saving equipments or life-saving, maybe even pharmaceutical drugs are certainly temperature-sensitive equipments and materials as well. So in that kind of a scenario, if I have my manufacturing base nearer to the customer, it's much easier to service the customer. And in this kind of a scenario, at this point in time in pandemic, in last 4 or 5 months, all of us have seen that the players who are nearer to the customers have been able to support their requirement much faster compared to players who have a large manufacturing setup at one part of the country. Because logistics has seen a big time disruption. There have been states operating individually like a silos or a separate area, because the lockdowns and containment zones were rules were completely different across regions, and hence I think the companies who went in for more contract manufacturing, having smaller manufacturing bases spread across the country, have been more successful. And I think going forward with the experience that each one of us have, I think more and more people will go for contract manufacturing or a small manufacturing setup spread across the country. That's the takeaway that I have.
Thank you, Keyur, for really being so precise and thought-provoking. And that takes us to the next set of discussion. What I really see is that the world will undergo a tremendous changes. The geopolitical dynamics in the world as they're folding, especially for India. The kind of natural disasters that's happening. Pandemic is, seems to be such a long pandemic. Very disrupting on all sides of life and livelihood, demand and supply, and hence a very strong resilient policy is important. But as Shayam said, and taking some clue from Keyur, we do need to really go near sourcing, but the near sourcing will take some time. How do you secure your sourcing from countries like China, where the whole, the single source, even the options are within the single source. So, Gordon, what are your views on managing supply chain, even when we transform our supply chain locations in future from a single source? What are the risk and disruption resilient policies that we need to build?
So there was, I mean, it's a really good question. I think what that means for procurement for me is I think we need to think about the strategies that we've been applying over the years. Traditionally, what most organizations seek to do is to consolidate suppliers. Yeah, and what they do is they bundle things together to notionally increase their bargaining power at the table. Whilst the drama, of course, is that what that does is it potentially creates pseudo monopolies. So what I think is going to happen is a whole bunch of unbundling. So rather than just saying, I'm just going to replace that supplier with a local supplier, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the outcome that supplier brings to me, and I want to replace the outcome of what that supplier does with a whole range of different suppliers. So I think we're going to see an increase in the number of suppliers that we're going to do business with. I think we're going to see an increase then in the number of contracts that we have to do business with, and an increase in the amount of collaboration and people that we're going to be doing business with. That's what I see is going to happen, and I think that's what the solution is going to be. You know, the beginning of the year, just as the pandemic was hitting, there was a report that came from Ardent Partners, and they said that only 9% of procurement functions in organizations had a strategic supply management risk management program. I'll just say like 9%, which meant that 91% didn't, because I can do maths, right? So 91% of organizations didn't have a strategic supplier risk management program. I think if we ask that now, I think that number will have changed. And one of the panelists mentioned it earlier. I think it was Dr. Mathur talked about scenario planning. I'm old enough to remember Y2K and be working when Y2K was in. And in the run-up to Y2K, all we did was scenario plan on our strategic suppliers. That's all we did. What if this supplier wasn't there? What if this supplier stopped working? How are we going to deliver the outcome that this supplier delivers for us? And what that did for us was to recognize it's not about focusing on the supplier. It's about focusing on the outcome that the supplier delivers for you.
That's interesting, Gordon. And I think that sets up the tone for building a resilience policy. I would also like to go to Dr. Mathur again and asking about his role of nearshoring or vocal-local as a resilient policies, and what are the challenges that India has or Indian pharmaceutical companies have in terms of building a local contract manufacturing or API base?
Yeah, again a very pertinent question, Dr. Singh, and very relevant to our times. But to answer that question, I'd just like to expand the scope a little bit and look at the entire supply chain end to end, and not just kind of restrict the answer to nearshoring or going for local. Going for local as against an an external or a foreign supplier. I think we need to kind of slice the data or our understanding of the network in a different way. And both these things, like Gordon and Keyur talked about the the importance of external manufacturing. So at the end of the day, external manufacturing companies are also your partners. And when you're looking at your suppliers, whether they are your external manufacturing partners or your material suppliers, your risk assessment approach should not be horizontal, in the sense it should not be just cutting across a group of suppliers. How do I de-risk a supplier of starting materials, or how do I de-risk a supplier of APIs? I think you have to cut across the entire network and draw a straight line between your front end product that you are selling, which is your formulation, and how does it connect back to your API source? How does that API source connect back to your starting material source? And therein you need to have a strategic view, not of your supplier base. You need to have a strategic view of your entire network, end to end. So I've just given you example of 3 points. There, the chain would actually extend back to much more. Okay, and what you need to understand in the pharma business is, in additional to just availability of material, the other important component is who owns that technology. I mean, it could be a patented process, or it could be an off-patented process, but you have the know-how of that process. Is it your own process? Is it something you have developed on your own, or is it your supplier's process? Okay. So when you have identified certain strategic areas you want to be in, or certain strategic products you have to be in, then you have to ensure that your entire supply chain for the product is secure. So that would mean if your technology is not there, you want to develop it. If you don't have control of the material, probably you want to manufacture the material itself. It could be an API. If you don't have control on the KSM, you want to bring that back into your in-house, or you want to de-risk it and add more suppliers to it. But having a strategic view not of your supplier base, but of your entire, what is at stake, the product that is at stake. You have a strategic view on that, and there, if it means that it brings you closer to source, brings you back to India, or does anything else, I think everything should be explored, and decisions should be taken, and that is a strategic view that one should have on your network. I don't know if I answered your question to your satisfaction.
No, that's a perfect view, because that's a kind of approach that most players are taking into account. We'll come back to that a little while later. Shayam, what are your views on local? Continuing the debate further, what are your views on local?
Yeah, so I think we have to look at what Dr. Mathur has said very correctly, that we have to look into all the aspect of this. It's not just particularly API, and we really become more resilient in the long term. But in the short term, our strategy should be different, short to medium term, because it has come out, as Gordon has pointed out, just 99% organization think strategically and was prepared for the risk aversion. So 91% organization were exposed to the supply chain risk, and it will be magnified with this COVID crisis. So we have to really see what we can do in the short term, medium term, and also keep pushing on the long term, because those two strategies are very contrasting. Maybe in the short to medium term, we have to buy supplies from China, we have to put extra inventories, we have to do that. But in the long term, we have to also work maybe with a collaborative or on its own, what kind of processes which we are putting, which can secure supply in the long term, when we say 3 years or 5 years. So those are the things have to very clearly demarcated.
Thank you very much. I'll just bring in Keyur for his view quickly on the local or nearshoring, and what are the constraints that you see. If you can be very short and simple on this, Keyur.
Sure, Dr. Singh. Thanks for that question. I think eventually, as we do risk assessments, or as the companies have done their risk assessments, we have come out that when we have our supplier sources nearer to our customers or nearer to our base, we'll be able to become more predictable, and we'll be able to support such crisis if it comes in future. Now that we have seen the worst of it, I think having manufacturing bases nearer to the customer would definitely help, and that could be a part of the medium term and long term strategy. While I agree to what Shayam was talking about, in the short term, we still would need to get materials from outside of India or wherever our source of suppliers are. But eventually, making the manufacturing base within the country nearer to the customer is the way forward that I see.
All right, Keyur. The next question is to Jigar. And Jigar, how important is partnership across supply chain to build resilience? And partnership, I mean collaboration and other issues that are very important across the supply chain. whether you take it as the outbound or inbound combined together. How do you build this partnership, and what has been your experience?
Guys, I'll quickly address on the problems that we faced during, the initial phase of lockdown, right? Because we know that Janta curfew was supposed to be for 1 day, and post that we got to know that it will be 2 weeks and 2 weeks and 2 weeks. While the central guidelines clearly dictated that the essential services, and pharma fell into essential services, will not be disrupted, the local implementation was completely different. So what we did at GSK was we really so GSK shut down their operations or our head office 2 weeks before the Janta curfew. So we were asked not to come to office. We were asked only to come to office if there is an absolute need for a face-to-face meeting. Our travel plans were completely banned since Feb. So we knew this is coming, right? Because we knew that this is going to be a global pandemic. We didn't wait for WHO to declare it's a global pandemic. Now, based on that, what we did was we really reached out to all our partners, right? And I say not suppliers, but partners, because we asked for business continuity plans. While it's stipulated in the contract for all technology, all logistics, all marketing partners, that there is a nearshore option of going to if there is a natural calamity hit. But this was a global natural calamity, right? So no region or no country was escaped from this. And logistics is such a local challenge. So we then just didn't get the BCP. We essentially spoke to all our transporters on a weekly basis, and in some cases on a daily basis, to understand at the ground level what the challenges are, right? Whether the truck drivers are getting food on their way from, Bombay to Bangalore, because, at the end of the day, those are human beings. They are driving for us, and they will need food. So on our second or third week, we faced the challenge that there is no dhabas or there are no food eateries on the highways that are open due to police restrictions, right? So we provided, food packets, water, refreshments at our CFAs. We spoke to all our CFA partners, warehousing partners, that please, whoever comes to your door as a GSK driver or, a GSK person, give them food. On the CFA side, on the ground level, some of our CFAs were not able to obtain the letter from the authority, right? So we worked with OPPI to get that letter that, okay, if the police comes and if the local authorities tries to shut down your plant, apart from all the hygiene factor, to provide them with that ground level letter with every possible support and so we formed an issue management team internally. So any supplier who had a challenge could reach out to me directly or could reach out to anybody from IMT, right? So that I think it's just not looking at a strategy. While we had the contractually covered to have BCPs, but in times like this, the BCPs really didn't hold much value, right? You really had to get into the trenches to understand what are the ground level problems and solve them.
All right. Thank you, Jigar. I think, Gordon, your last comment on partnership, collaboration on the inbound, that is procurement, where the shift from the spend management to managing the whole supply chain is important, and collaboration and securing bases and securing finances and cash is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. The key thing, certainly when you're looking for risk, I think you have to obviously go deeper than just a simple financial assessment. The understanding how the cash flows goes through. And I think when you think about where some of the issues were, it was probably because the visibility of the supply chains, which my panel partners have turned around and talked about, wasn't there beyond tier 2, right? So tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 was invisible to us. We didn't necessarily know where they were. So recognizing that there's probably some more work that we need to do into that, like the scenario modeling, and driving greater collaboration with suppliers. I think it was, I read something somewhere, Ford turned around once and said, all innovation comes from our suppliers. So suppliers are in effect directly impacting your customers. So therefore we have to drive this greater collaboration with suppliers, and especially when we're going to be, supply chains were moving away from global supply chains before COVID. Yep, that much we absolutely know. They were becoming more regionalized and more localized before COVID hit. What COVID has done is massively sped up that process. and the need to drive collaboration with our partners, both digitally and in the way that we act. So there's a matrix that we use in negotiation, the impact on the relationship and the impact on the outcome. And balancing those two is going to be more important than ever.
Thank you, Gordon. That's very interesting. And impact of relationship is a very important element of resilience. So the last question of the panel, I would ask Keyur to let me know, how do you build a resilience during the pandemic, taking into account people issues like health and safety, which will play a very important role when we reimagine the supply chain post this COVID. How does one secure people and also ensure availability of transportation and warehouses? From the people perspective, there's a lot of talk about bionic supply chains, and this becomes a very important element of your resilience strategy.
Right. So in India, Dr. Rakesh, we would have seen that it's a highly labor-intensive manufacturing or warehousing operations or logistics per se. And we also heard Jigar talk about BCPs per se, which most of the companies would have prepared and would have shared it to all the stakeholders who are engaged with them. And as rightly told by Jigar, that those BCPs were on paper. But what was required was to extend those extended arm, look at an extended supply chain per se. And when I say extended supply chain, it talks about the supplier, the company, the parent company, and the customers together, coming together, connecting together. And I think putting a robust business continuity plan in place, extending that arm to make sure that you have continuity of operations. And when I say continuity of operations, people is the key to that, because in India you can't have manufacturing setups without people. While most of the office employees, as Jigar said, were working from home and not required to attend the office, and that's probably true for all the offices in India and maybe across the globe. But we will not see a manufacturing location without bare minimum people to operate that, or a warehousing operations or distribution center to have operations without people. So how do you make sure that you make those people confident of the health and safety aspects when they are on the ground? And hence that was the key requirement, so to say. The benchmark and standards of safety and health took a different level in terms of hygiene, upkeep, and I think it went into a implementing behavioral safety culture within the organizations. And I think I've seen organizations who have gone to that level faster have been able to meet the customer requirements and have been able to become more resilient and fight the pandemic much better compared to other organizations. So eventually what I see is the safety requirements and health of people is going to take a different view, and all of us who were thinking of safety as only ground safety is going to change onto more towards people and health aspects on the shop floors.
Thank you, Keyur, for that particular good insight about people, because people have been ignored and supply chains and pandemic has forced people to come into being.
Sure.
In fact, when we look at the summary of this discussion, it has been very interesting to start with Dr. Mathur really bringing why the supply chain pharma should have been better, but it can still be better. And when we move ahead with the securing the supply chain, there's an approach where a lot of companies like Lamasoft, even SAP, have been using this is to map the supply chain geographies. And what you do is that when you do this, according to some professors who have really done good work like Yossi Sefi and David Limchis, they have actually found out that when you map the various tiers of the supply chain, as all of them, Ford found that the 2% of their suppliers were the main problem, which disrupted their supply chain for almost 2.5 months. And hence identifying those non-critical suppliers can also become very important, and hence a kind of visibility of granularity of the multi-tier supply chain is very important. Secondly, when we look at local, yes, technology plays a very important role, your IP plays a very important role, but one element that should play a big role in deciding where you need to go is that if your time of recovery is more than the time of survival in terms of your cash flows, in terms of your sustainability, you better start looking at nearshoring and local and vocal approaches and diversifying to nearby places. And I think that's a good index which has been built up by MIT transportation centers to look at a stress test of your locational or geography or supply chain in a big way. No doubt. One thing that is important for all of us, what Gordon said, or Gregory said, or even Dr. Mathur said, is that we need to look at the supply chain from end-to-end perspective. It's demand that would determine the final raw material that needs to be sourced. How do you integrate, harmonize, and synchronize demand? Because it's very important. I just read a report yesterday by Laura Serrer, and I think that was very interesting point she brings that integration is overplayed. What we need is your sales budget, your sales forecast, your sales plan, your finance budgets, your supply chain and procurement plan needs not only to integrate, but to harmonize and synchronize, because they have different database, different contexts, and there is a need to harmonize, bringing them together for insights using new technology. And once we can do this, a large amount of outside in data is important as a part of planning. And I think that's the missing link in most pharmaceutical that even we have done some work with. I have talked to friends like Mathur. That is a very important element which lacks. And I think organizations have been very inside out, and hence there is a need to bring this outside in approaches. Can we harmonize our supply chain from the data demand to the last tier of supply chain, bring visibility, whether you call it a control tower, we call it a connected planning, or you call it simply a very well-connected, digitalized platform which shows visibility is important. So I think, all of us brought out these points. Thank you for the session. And I have a question from Metali Sadwani. Is there any benchmark in value or volumes of inventory built up across Indian pharma companies being decided to secure Indian domestic FG supplies for essential medicine and also the essential medicines for chronic disease for exports? Anybody? It's open to all questions, so anyone can take up the question. Mathur, sir? Keyur?
I think the deciding on the inventory levels, what I understood the question is to decide the inventory levels in pharma companies and having a benchmark study of sorts, right?
Right.
I think to my mind, it's very different for different organizations. Depending on the current state where the manufacturing base or the sourcing locations are, that would determine the inventory levels that each one of the manufacturers or the companies would determine. And secondly, it also depends on the kind of risk assessments that one does and the service level that one wants to offer would determine the inventory levels. And probably, I think a couple of months down the line, we would be able to get a benchmark study when we look at all pharma companies coming out and reporting their inventory numbers, and that's where we will be able to see how have the inventories been across the chain, and which of the pharma companies have been able to get the edge over the other because of a different mix that they have been able to cope up. I think that's my understanding on the inventory side at this point in time.
All right. I think most of the other questions that we have got are repetitive of what questions that I have asked. So I think that could be on APIs and securing supplies and forecasting. So I think that should be one question. If anyone wants to take that question or add any comment to the discussion, we have 1 or 2 minutes for us. Gordon, do you want to say something?
I just actually on the inventory, inventory question, there is a benchmarking organization that does a lot of that kind of stuff. I don't have a membership, but I do know that CAPS, I think it's the Center for Advanced Purchasing Statistics, has inventory stuff, and that might be a good place to look. Is probably something along those lines. In terms of securing supply base, I think for me it's when you start thinking about risk management, it really is that's the key thing for securing supply base for me is having a really good, strong risk management program that looks at things like we've mentioned, like cash flow, like labor. And I think when we think about labor, we've got to think beyond the labor that we employ and think about the labor in the external workforce and the extended workforce as well, because that is an untapped source to us when we're thinking about labor, both in terms of what value it's going to give to us, but also to Keyur's point around the health and safety, because if they're on our sites, then they're our responsibility. So this extended workforce, we've got to think about how we manage that, and we've got to think about how we tap into it, especially when we start thinking about what are we going to look like in terms of a procurement and supply chain organization going forward. Do I need to have people constantly, or do I just access and tap into external expertise whenever I need it? And I see that probably coming more and more over the next decade. Is this extended workforce becoming very important? And that's going to be a key thing to start driving resilience, because if we're thinking about some of the key strategies that we're going to be seeing driving forward, having robust category management strategies that consider other sourcing strategies other than supply consolidation, other than just running a tender, has to be there. I think the constant recruiting, I use some sports analogies. You don't wait for someone to retire before you start planning to replace them. Fairly sure that when Sachin retired, they'd already started planning to replace him. When Dhoni's retired, they've started planning to replace him. The same's true, right, in terms of our organizations. We have to think about how do we get on the front foot for succession planning and decide, do we replace internally with a full-time employee, or do we replace by using the market? And I think that's key for building resilience in terms of the broader supply chains.
Thank you, Gregory. That's very important. When the uncertainty is very high, obviously we need to replace by internal person. When the uncertainty is less, you can go the over-the-counter buying of even the services. So I think this takes us to the end of the webinar, and I request Jason to give the vote of the thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I would like to thank all the panel members. Thank you, Dr. Ravi. Thank you, Shayam. Thank you, Jigar. Thank you, Keyur. Thank you, Bbraun. Thanks to Greg and thanks to Sumat. It was indeed a wonderful session and I think a good takeaway for all the attendees today. Thank you very much for being there. I would also like to thank all the attendees for coming and being a part of the webinar. And thanks to Team ISCM for making it happen. Thank you so much. Have a great day.